Okay, hello everyone. This is Edessa. I am the Sales and Marketing Coordinator at Web Courseworks. And again, thank you for joining our webinar this morning. We have reached the half hour and we will be getting started with today's webinar. But first, I'd like to introduce one of our speakers. John Alexson is the CEO of Web Courseworks, and he will introduce today's webinar and speaker. John, take it away.
Hi, Edessa. Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about some upcoming events, right, Edessa? Great. Yeah, so for those of you in the association space, you probably all know about the ASAE, which is the American Society of Association Executives big annual conference. It's going to be in Columbus, Ohio, and we encourage you to visit our booth 1906 and have a chance to win a Spark drone. We also want to promote Solutions Day. This is an event sponsored by Org Community. We're going to do a demo of our system in Schaumburg, Illinois on September 19th at 10:10. So we also have an upcoming webinar. We always have these the last Tuesday of the month at 11:30 a.m. Central. Actually, I'm going to be speaking about the ins and outs of working with subject matter experts. This is near and dear to my heart as I did my dissertation on this subject and wrote the book called Mind Melds. This is sponsored by Association Trends. So I'm John Alexson. I want to introduce David Kelly. I first want to say that I recently wrote a blog post for our blog called managingelearning.com about the 10 reasons to join the eLearning Guild. I've followed the Guild for some 20 years and have been to their various conferences as a session speaker or an exhibitor. And it is a fantastic organization. And David, I'm really happy you could spend the hour with us today. David Kelly is the Executive Vice President and Executive Director of the eLearning Guild. David has been a learning and performance consultant and training director for more than 15 years. He is indeed a leading learning voice, exploring how technology can be used to enhance training, education, learning, and organizational performance. David's an active member of the learning community and can frequently be found speaking at industry events, which include the famous ATD, or formerly ASTD, and he's contributed to eLearn magazine and others. David is also known for his curation efforts, and I encourage you to subscribe to his weekly curation blog. Without further ado, let me introduce David. David?
Thanks so much, John. I really appreciate you joining me here today. I'm just waiting for the slides to come back up. Give it a second.
Yep, we are seeing the right.
Oh, okay, perfect. Sorry about that, everybody. All right, so we're here to discuss professional development for L&D professionals. It's an important topic that is near and dear to my heart. So I was privileged and happy to be sharing this conversation with you here today. To kick things off, I just have a simple question for you. What does the term professional development mean to you? Feel free to use chat. I'd like to see, just as a general idea, what it is that people think when, what does it mean to you? How do you define it? Anything that comes to your mind when you hear the phrase professional development, you can put it right into chat. And I just want to see some of the options that are there. All right. Good. All right. Well, we have a couple of different things here. Let me just show you what one of the definitions. Whenever I have a term that I want to define, I usually just go to Google and say, you know, what is the most common answer? And usually get a Google snippet that's there. This is what you're seeing here within the Google snippet, that the interwebs, so to speak, have told us what this professional development definition is. Learning to earn or maintain professional credentials such as academic degrees, to formal coursework, attending conferences, and informal learning opportunities situated in practice. It has been described as intensive and collaborative, ideally incorporating an evaluation stage, which is a good definition, but in my opinion, it is also a definition that is radically incomplete. I personally don't agree with this definition. I don't think that it's per se an inaccurate description, but I think it's incomplete. And when I say that it's incomplete, the reason that I say that is because it's missing a very, very key word to me. There's a word that any professional development conversation to me is incomplete without it being included. And to me, that word is network. In today's day and age, in a digital world, everything is about the network that surrounds you. And we tend to think of a network in a very defined way. Some people define it as a social network, as a human network. I want to spend some time talking about this idea of a personal learning network. Because for me, the potential of your professional development, not only the professional development that we provide to others, but the professional development that we provide for ourselves is built upon this idea of a personal learning network. And I want to spend a good portion of our time here today talking about this idea of a personal learning network, because it is my opinion that the network is what powers an individual's professional development. So I keep using this phrase, personal learning network. You'll also hear it phrased as PLN. That's another way that this is often described. But what is it? What is a personal learning network? Well, if we're going to use the internet as I did before, let's look at what the internet has described as a personal learning network. An informal learning network that consists of people a learner interacts with and derives knowledge from in a personal learning environment. In a PLN, a person makes a connection with another person with the specific intent that some type of learning will occur because of that connection. That's straight off of Wikipedia. And actually, as much as I said the other one was incomplete, I'm actually going to go a little further on this one and say that I find this to be actually inaccurate. I don't agree with this personal definition. I think it's incomplete to the point of being inaccurate. So I don't think that there is a standard, you're not going to find Webster's dictionary defining personal learning network. So there is no one standard definition, but I will, since I'm saying that I find this to be inaccurate, I'll define it from my own point of view. So this is literally just my definition. I find a personal learning network, or PLN, is the environment of resources that contribute to an individual's personal growth. PLNs are not created, they exist and every person has one. The question is how intentional an individual might be about expanding their network and leveraging it strategically. The biggest thing for me in that definition that I've provided you there is the idea that PLNs aren't created. I'm often asked in discussions around the idea of professional development, how do I create the network? And some people are actually puzzled when I respond that you don't. It's there. It's a question of how well you nurture it. Because that is a big difference in terms of how you approach a personal learning network. It's not a matter of creating one. Even someone, if you think about it from a metaphor standpoint, think of it like an ecosystem. Ecosystems exist. The desert has just as much of an ecosystem as the rainforest. It's just that the desert is not as well supported, it's not as robust, it's not as vibrant, but they are both still existing as an ecosystem. Your personal learning network is the same thing. It exists. It's a question of how intentional you are about supporting it and helping it grow. So I want to give you some tips on how to do that, but first I want to talk a little bit about why this is so important. These are, and especially I want to put it in the context of the people who are on this call. I think their personal learning networks are important for every individual on earth, but I want to put it specifically in the context of today's L&D professionals. The biggest reason that I find personal learning networks to be so important, and professional development in general for L&D professionals, is the fact that the responsibilities of our daily work often define what you can learn. I spent a good 15, 20 years in training and development roles, instructional designer up to chief learning officer in different environments. But the first 10 years I spent in my career, I spent in one institution, a financial institution. And it wasn't until that I left there that I realized that everything that I was learning was being defined by what I was doing. It was everything that I needed. It was, if I had a problem in the context of my work, I went out and learned how to solve that problem, which is different than really looking at it from the context of growth. It wasn't until I left that first institution that I really took a different look at my professional development and decided that I wanted to be the one driving my professional development, not my employer. I wanted to make sure that I was growing in the areas that I wanted to grow, not necessarily allowing the daily grind, so to speak, to define what I want to do. And that's a critical need for learning professionals. I think that one of the greatest ironies in our field is that we are responsible for providing resources for individuals to grow professionally. And yet we are often the first people to forget to do that for ourselves. And a lot of that is based on this idea of we allow our development to be dictated by what we do in our day-to-day activities. And there's a danger in that. There's a big danger in allowing work to define how you grow. If you haven't already seen the TED Talk from Eli Pariser, it's a couple of years old, but it's called Beware Online Filter Bubbles. It's an extremely powerful video that I think everyone should watch in terms of how the personalization of the internet affects our daily lives. But I want to put it in the context of learning. The video is great on its own, but I want to put it in the context of learning. If you think about how we learn today, most of it is going through some level of a digital portal. And there's limitless information that's available online that we can learn from. But you have to realize how we're accessing it. We're accessing it through portals. We're accessing it through different portals. And you see some of them around this circle in the center here. For instance, Amazon, Netflix, Yahoo News, these are all personal ways that we access. These are all different portals through which we access the limitless world of information that's out there. But take some of the ubiquitous ones that are fairly out there. Most of you who are on this call have probably bought something on Amazon. And I know myself, when I purchase something on Amazon, after I get to that checkout page, one of the first things I think of afterwards is, oh, I want that too, because they give you that little line underneath the confirmation of other things you might be interested in, and it's spot on. It's always spot on in terms of what it is that you want. And you think about Netflix, if you're a Netflix user, and how it makes recommendations that are really in the zone of often of what you're interested in. And it's fascinating to think about how personalized that experience is. All of these portals that you see on here are in the business of personalization. Excuse me, because they want to be your go-to in terms of how you get information. Google, Bing, all these search engines are in a battle to find out who can get you the best answer, who can find you what you want based on what you search in. And it's so much information is being compiled to learn more about us so that we can deliver that personalized experience, which in that context is not a bad thing. And the ability of services that are out there to tailor to our needs to help give us what it is that we want. And in that context, it's not bad. But if you think about it in the context of every single portal through which we use to go online is doing that for us, it changes what we are exposed to. Instead of getting this limitless world that you see on the outer part of the circle, when we start bringing it in through these portals, we don't get the limitless world. We get the world that agrees with us already. We get a world of things that are personalized for us, things that we're already interested in. And that's in the context of personal growth and in the context of the work by extension that we do as L&D professionals, this is a problem. Because personal growth doesn't come from within this circle. It's what comes from outside of the circle where the personal growth comes in. It's one of the reasons I, as an L&D professional, am so interested in the world of curation. Because curation isn't about pulling in these things that you're already interested in. It's about pulling things outside of the circle that you have that has a connection to you, but you can't see it, and bringing it into your field of view. It's one of the reasons I think curation is so powerful. But without a conscious effort to go outside of this circle, you don't get the limitless world of growth that is possible through all the information that's out there. Your internet looks like this, and that's a problem. That's that's a challenge that we all must need to work through in this increasingly personalized digital world. We want to be able to get to everything that's out there, but in order to do that, we have to find a way to get beyond the personalization of the portals that we're using. Another reason that PLNs are critical to L&D professionals is that we often lose it. Personal growth is one of the first things that falls off the table in the fast-moving world of now. I mean, we're all L&D professionals on this. I said I've been in this field for a couple of decades. I remember a world where someone would come to me with a problem, And I would come back to them a couple of days later with a plan that, a very Reader's Digest version, consisted of a couple of weeks of needs analysis, a couple of weeks of putting together a pilot program, 2 weeks of implementing that pilot program, 2 weeks of analyzing the results of the pilot program before we did a rollout over another 2 months. That wasn't that uncommon to have timelines for projects that were measured in months. And now we live in an environment where someone comes to you on Friday, tells you they need a solution on Monday. That's not an exaggeration. That's life for many people. And when you're living in an environment of now, we are always concentrating on the urgent. You know, if you ever saw that 4-quadrant thing between importancy and important things that are important and urgent, the one that always falls off the table are things that are important but not urgent. And personal growth is one of those things. It's easy to allow it to fall off the table in the noise of now. And if we want to be intentional about our personal and learning networks, that's one of the ways we can get over that gap. And the most important thing in my mind is if you aren't looking outside of your everyday life, you never know what's possible. Many of the greatest ideas and best solutions that I've found to problems that organizations that I've worked with have been dealing with haven't been things that we've already been doing internally. It's been looking outside of our organization where I could find a solution that someone else was doing because they were looking at the work a different way. You really can't understand what's possible if you're only looking within your existing circle. So that's the world that we live in L&D. And one of the things I would also add to that is it's not just today's environment. I mean, the need to do this as an L&D professional has existed for decades. I would say that there is more urgency to it today because there are so many technologies and methodologies and changes that are happening to the future of work itself that are, you know, you go back a decade in time when all we had was desktop, all we had was the classroom as trainers. I'm showing my age now, but all we had was the classroom as a trainer. And then suddenly these desktop PCs came out and this world of e-learning emerged. That was really disruptive, and it was a challenge, and we needed to develop ourselves to harness this new technology. But that was one change. We're living in an environment now where over the next 5 to 10 years, there are going to be a number of critical changes that are happening just to the nature of work and how work gets done in an organization that we're going to need to support. That it is a period of rapid change within organizations and within the world of L&D to support those organizations. So it's critical that we are looking at the outside world, understanding how the future of work is changing so that we can prepare ourselves to support that new world. And again, I think a personal learning network is the critical foundation to support that professional development. So what does this look like in practice? Where does this idea of a PLN even exist? A lot of people talk about these PLNs and say, oh, it's on social media, it's all this. There is no one answer to that, but you have to be able to put this into your own context. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share my context with you. It's going to give you an idea of how I map out my personal learning network so that you can then apply that context to how you want to support your own. Because depending on where you're getting your ROI, so to speak, in terms of your efforts, you might want to put more of your efforts into certain areas of your PLN over others. But for me, I break it down, excuse me, I break it down into 6 different areas. If you kind of put yourself in the middle, I personally break my personal learning network down into 6 major categories. The first one being your face-to-face interactions, where you have the opportunity to meet people face-to-face. That is a critical component of it, and even in the world of the digital environment where we can connect in all these different ways, face-to-face to me is still a critical component of it. Find opportunities to meet with people, see them face-to-face, interact with them in the real world, still a major component of my personal learning network. Another piece of it are the communities. So face-to-face interactions with individuals, communities in general that I want to engage with. And there are a number of different communities that you can engage with. I have a couple that I consider really important to me listed here. But this is where you find your people. Some people use the phrase find your tribe. This is what you can go out and find the communities that feed the curiosity that you have and the growth goals that you have. And there's formal learning opportunities, the traditional formal learning opportunities, be them classes, workshops, whatever it happens to be. Those are still part of my network. Those are still a critical part of how I grow. When I want to take a deep dive into something, I will still look at those opportunities. We also have the ability to do reference and research. That's a critical component of the entire equation as well. The ability to go out and find the information. We all live in an environment where we have the limitless world of information in our pocket in an ever-connected device. You know, we've all been at that dinner party that is going great and everybody's having a great time and the conversation and the drinks are flowing and everything's going great. And then someone asks a question that no one at the table knows the answer to, and it brings the table to a pause. Everything stops for about a second and a half before someone reaches into their pocket and says, "That's a great question, I'm going to Google it." And we need to, that's the environment we live in, the ability to just go out and find the information, do the research, find the information. Another critical component of the network that I use.
Say, David.
Yeah, please.
This is John. Before you get into the bookmarking tools, which I think are great, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the formal learning, because I think that can be broken down into many different segments in itself. And it's interesting to, I think, our audience of association professionals, since that's what they often make a living doing, is putting on formal learning events. And I'm just wondering, where does something like a LinkedIn Learning fit in, which is, you know, watching a video. I know a lot of companies subscribe, they encourage their employees to watch the LinkedIn Learning pieces. Where would you put something like that?
Sure. So I would, each of the categories that I'm going to go through, they are not silos. There's a definite overlap between all of them. For me, something like a LinkedIn Learning, there's a mix of the formal, but there's also the mix of the community. There's also the mix of the social network that's within that. Because you have, obviously, on its core format, so to speak, you could put that in as a formal learning thing, because it is, most of the stuff that's on LinkedIn is course-based. But it also depends on how you consume it and what you do with it afterwards. So at its core, it might be a formal learning piece. But there's also the opportunity, if I'm going to be doing that with other people and we have a conversation around that content, then it becomes a face-to-face interaction. If there's something on a social network, which I'll get to in a second, where there's people interacting about that content, where there's comments and such, then there's a blur between the formal learning and the social network.
Right. And
also,
David, what have you seen in the workplace in terms of employers encouraging employees to take company time to go into some of these formal and informal learning opportunities?
You know, it depends on the culture. There's a wide spectrum in terms of how organizations do, or in some cases do not, support the growth of their individuals. The one piece, the phrase that I often use in that is, it sounds harsh, but it's necessarily harsh in my mind, is there's not an employer on earth that really cares about learning. And that's not meant as harsh as it sounds, because, and some people on this call might be thinking, no, we totally care about learning. We have a learning culture, and that could be the case. But I still go back to the original statement. No organization cares about learning. Even if your organization supports learning and has a strong learning culture, as we as L&D professionals define it, it's because they see the connection between learning, growth, and success of the business. So if there was no connection there, they wouldn't care about learning in that capacity. They ultimately, learning is not what they care about. Learning is a means to an end to getting people to perform better and have the organization grow. So I do think that there is a spectrum of impact there, where some organizations still need to learn the connections between learning and development in their maturity model, where others are a little further along. What I personally see is, I think overall, there is growth in that area. There is growth in terms of, if we had metrics around what the average was, the average is increasing in terms of where the average maturity might be of organizations across the board. The challenge for me, as I always say to people, is it doesn't even really matter where the average is. You have to understand where your organization is culturally and what you might be able to do to help it take the next step, whatever that next step may be. One other thing I would add to it to relate some kind of tangential to your question is, regardless of, I go back to where I started from in the conversation I had sharing my own story, regardless of where your organization is, you own your professional development. And whether you're getting the support of your employer that you would like to see or not, you own it, and you've got to find the ways to prioritize that with the resources you have available, whether they're your own or whether they come from the employer. And when I say resources, I'm not talking about money. The biggest resource, in my opinion, on your professional development is not money, it's time. So with that, let me go through the other two sections that I include within my personal PLN. The first one, as we saw a second ago, was the bookmarking tools. These are critical for me. I have a couple of different bookmarking tools that are in my browser, because a lot of times you encounter things throughout the day that pique your interests, but you don't have time to dive into them right away. The internet is one of the most distracting places on Earth, and a lot of times, in order to stay focused on tasks, you see something, but you can't look at it right now. You got to move on. And I find bookmarking tools like Digo, Evernote, and Pocket to be extremely powerful at, and I'll give a little bit more examples of that in a minute. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier the social networks. Lots of different social networks out there. Pick your poison, whichever one you personally like. But I also think how you look at them is critical. So this is kind of a map of what my network is, but I want to dive into a couple of these a little bit differently, because as I said, these exist. My personal learning network exists, but how robust it is, how much it supports my growth, how intentional I am about it is what really makes my professional development successful or more successful or less successful. So ultimately, it's a matter of what can I do to enhance this personal network? What can I do to make that network stronger? Because it's not about creating it, it's about nurturing it so that it can grow and can make it something that is more powerful for you. And the biggest piece of this that I would say is that it is a strategic thing. It is not something that you just, if you want to have a strong personal learning network and you want to really control your professional development, it's got to be strategic. You've got to make conscious choices on what you're going to do and who you're going to connect with, how you're going to connect with it. And I want to talk about go back to those 6 different categories and give you some examples around what I mean by being strategic. So let's start with face-to-face interactions. First thing is face-to-face interactions is, again, we've got to break through that circle of the lens through which we naturally see the world. The image that I use here is a picture of my son. He's wearing Google glasses from a couple of years ago. And the reason that I use that picture here is because this is shortly after I came home with the device. If you're not familiar with Google Glass, it's an early adaptation of augmented reality headset. And he wanted to try it out. And the first thing that he said when he was putting it on is, "Dad, can I see through walls with this?" Which as an adult was a completely ridiculous statement to me. I was like, of course you can't see through walls. But he was looking at he had no idea what AR was, and he was looking at it through a different lens. And I was like, wow, what if you could do something like that? So sometimes being intentional to connect with someone who looks at the world differently than you can help you see something differently than you're able to see yourself, which in and of itself is a moment of growth. I would also say within the face-to-face interactions is you want to find people whose backgrounds are different than your own. One of the most powerful things in the world right now is how easy it is to connect with people globally. You can find people who have different perspectives from all around the world, and that helps you grow. If you only look within your own organization or within your own culture or within your own geography, you're gonna have certain blinders to other worlds. And the biggest thing that we can do to grow is to put spotlights on our blind spots. And you're not going to be able to do that unless you go outside of your comfort zone to find someone else who can show you that a blind spot exists. So finding a diverse network of people who are different than yourself is critical. I mentioned the communities. Communities is a big part of this as well. You want to engage in communities where there are discussions that stretch your skill set. I list 3 different organizations here, and they are very different from one another. One of them, the guild, obviously is something that is a little within the zone of the group of people who are probably on this webinar. The other two might be a little outside of the zone, but I want to share why I have each of them in here, because it again, from a professional development standpoint, it's critical. The guild is the obvious one. I'm an L&D professional. I found the guild because I was connected to another professional development organization in the field. And at some point, after being within that community for about 8 to 10 years, I started going to the conference, started going to online meetings, and I kept feeling like I wasn't getting anything. Like I had gotten everything that I possibly could from that community. I wanted more. And that's when I started mentioning it to people. And that's what people are saying, you should check out the guild. You should check out the eLearning guild. They do things that are a little bit more advanced and in your space. So part of the takeaway for that is part of being within a community is knowing that it's scratching the itch that you need. It's giving you what you need. And in some cases you might graduate metaphorically from one community and need to find another one that is able to give you what you need. So for me, that's the L&D bucket being filled. The CES one, Consumer Electronics Show, and the Consumer Technology Association, my niche is learning and technology. I am the executive director for the eLearning Guild. I run our community. I oversee all of our conferences, and I will tell you, as that person, that the most important event that I track every year is not an L&D event. It's the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. Why? Because I'm a firm believer that if you want to understand how technology is changing the way that we learn, you have to understand how technology is changing how we live our daily lives. And that community and that event, the Consumer Electronics Show, is where that conversation is most visible. And that's why it's so important to me. So it's giving me a different point of view than what I get from an L&D, and then I bring that context into my work. And then the last one is the Content Marketing Institute. Being someone who works for the eLearning Guild, we do a lot of marketing, so it helps me develop that skill set. And I also believe that there's a huge amount that L&D professionals can learn from the field of marketing. So I bring that context into the work that I do as an L&D professional as well. So again, the communities that you choose to belong to are a big driver of how you want to set your goals for professional development. The bookmarking tools that we talked about earlier, these are great. I mean, that not only is in the context that I mentioned earlier, just in the sense of I want to read this later, but also I use Diigo all the time, and over time, Diigo is often something that becomes my search engine because I've bookmarked so many things and I add tags of context to everything that I bookmark that a lot of times I will have a problem, go into Diigo, describe the problem in terms of tags, and I'll find a resource that I had forgotten that I bookmarked a couple of years ago that has some information that is going to help me solve that problem. Again, that's me building a library of resources through these bookmarking tools that I can mine in the context of my own professional growth. And then we have reference and research. Whether you're using Wikipedia, whether you're using RSS feeds, Google, whatever it happens to be, these are tools that are used in self-guided exploration and discovery. This is not just as simple as going to Google and doing a search. That's part of it, but that is a rudimentary part of it. Understanding how to do advanced searches, how to do things, how to mine these databases that are out there. It was mentioned in my bio that I do a lot of curation of conferences and such. Most of that back channel that I track is on Twitter. I could do a basic search, but really to find what I'm looking for is I've learned how to use the advanced search methodologies in Twitter to really find the answers that I'm looking for. Knowing how to use these tools and the advanced search functionality is a huge part of the reference and research bucket for me. And then, of course, as we touched on, the formal learning. You want to find the formal learning programs that are going to give you the opportunity to enhance your skills. This is where you might want to take a deep dive. There are some conversations in L&D that kind of describe formal learning as something, you know, I hate the word, I never use the word dead in conversations that I'm doing. Nothing is dead, nothing is dying. There's no piece of the L&D puzzle that is going away. It might just be becoming a smaller piece of the pie because we're adding more pieces. Formal learning is not going away. If you need to take a deep dive into something that you're a novice on and you need to rapidly build some skill set, build some knowledge, formal learning is a great opportunity. But as I mentioned earlier, Formal learning also becomes the foundation through which some of the other buckets can also be filled, being your face-to-face interactions, your social networks. It's giving you the ability to develop a skill set, as an aside, that I feel is critical for L&D professionals that formal learning is a big piece of, is this idea of conversational competence, which I think is a big skill that L&D professionals need to develop. I define conversational competence at an overly simplified level as the ability to conduct a conversation about a topic. When you have all these different things that are shaping the future of work, I'll just throw out a couple real quick. You've got artificial intelligence, big data, data and analysis, virtual reality, augmented reality, spatial computing. Those are just a couple off the top of my head. These are things that are shaping the future of work. Whether your organization is leveraging these today, or whether they're going to leverage them tomorrow, or whether they're going to leverage them a couple of years from now, most of those technologies that are there, they're not an if, they're a when. And conversational competence, in my mind, that again, overly simplified, is to know enough about it that even if you're not going to drive it into your organization, if you get a knock on the door from your IT department saying, we just put in a new server, it's going to connect some APIs so we can harness the information that is coming from your system, tap it into our larger system, our HRS system, our LRS, whatever it happens to be, you want to be ready to participate in that conversation. They're going to ask you to support it. You want to be able to know what's going on. Again, formal learning is a big part of that. Then we've touched a couple of times on the social networks. This gives us the ability to remove geography from the equation, to connect and learn from individuals regardless of where they are. But I also think it's a big piece of, part of the social network is not just the connections, it's engaging with people, it's participating. There's a lot of people who read and consume information off social media, and that's great. But if you want to put it in context, you have to participate. Fly on the wall is going to help you learn to a certain degree, but it's only by joining the conversation that you can really put it in the context of what this information means for you. And it's also a matter of looking at these networks a little differently. It's not just a matter of doing what you normally do on these networks. You have to look at them a little differently sometimes. For instance, one of the biggest social networks that I use for my professional development is Facebook. A lot of people think of Facebook as just, this is where Facebook's for my friends, LinkedIn's for my work, that kind of a thing. I use Facebook for professional development all the time. There are a lot of great organizations that are out there that share good information, and I use Facebook personally as well, but when I'm in my feed, I see something from a friend, something from family, something from friends, something professional development related. And it's just part of my daily activity. A big part of making professional development intentional for you is just finding ways to embed it into the work you're already doing, or something you're already doing. And for me, Facebook is a great example of that. If I'm on Facebook seeing what's going on in life in general, and I can find ways to insert professional development opportunities into that workflow, it makes it just part of, it doesn't make it something I have to additionally do on my to-do list. It's something that's just part of me living my life. Facebook's a great example of that. I would also say looking at Pinterest is a different thing. A lot of people think Pinterest is just these pictures that are there, but it's not always the tool, it's how it's being used. One of my favorite boards on Pinterest is this board called What Does Learning Look Like?, where people are just sharing pictures of what learning looks like to you. And when you see all of these different interpretations of what learning looks like, it breaks through the barriers of what you think is and helps you see what could be. Again, look at the social networks a little differently. It helps tremendously in terms of how you can leverage them for professional development. So within that, what you can do is also use these networks to ask people to solve your problems. That, to me, is one of the key moments in a professional development network, and the key aha moments in a PLN. I remember distinctly being in a meeting at a bank, excuse me, about, God, it's got to be 10, 15 years ago. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember the moment very well. Being in a meeting, and it was a meeting that, even though I haven't met most of you here, you've probably sat in the meeting, where you're sitting in a meeting and everybody discusses a problem, and the meeting is going to end by people leaving, thinking about the problem, so that we can come back a week from now to have another meeting where we continue to discuss the problem. And as this meeting was ending, and we were discussing who was going to look into different things as we left the meeting, I had my phone out, and I just tweeted to my network, because I'm big on Twitter, what the problem was. You know, I'm curious, has anyone ever had this problem? How did you solve it? And while we were still in the meeting, I got 3 responses. And one of them I thought was pretty interesting in the context of what we were trying to do. So I just kind of said, before we leave the meeting, what about this? And that was the solution we wound up applying. And having a robust network of people, that's a business value right there. That was one of the few moments, going back to the question John was asking before, how can you get an organization to look at this sort of personal learning network and professional development differently to support it? Anytime you have an opportunity to show how it helped the business, you do that. I remember Jane Bozarth said to me years ago, every single time her personal network, when she was working in state government, every single time her network solved the problem for her, she took a picture of the screen and sent it to her boss. And it was just basically saying, you know, you wonder why I find these things important. Here's the answer. Here's where I got the answer to that problem. And it just gets the organization to look at this differently. And the last thing on here in terms of the social networks, which I think it's a bit of an aside, but it's important, is the strength of your personal brand as an individual has a direct impact on the strength of your PLN. There are certain networks that I will joke around in, and there are certain networks that I have a more professional narrative in. Everything that we do online, as I say to my daughter, everything that we do online is there forever. Whether you think it's there forever or not, it's basically there forever. And the stuff that we do online has a direct impact on the strength of your PLN. For instance, I mentioned earlier that one of the big environments for me online is Twitter for my professional networking. When I first went on Twitter, I would do everything on Twitter. I would throw some jokes around. I would I would connect in some business stuff. But as I started getting more and more involved and putting more energy into the business, I just think, again, one of those key moments where I was about to type one of those jokes I had typed and put in a number of times, and I kind of felt that's not consistent with what I've been doing lately on the business side, because it was off-brand for me personally. And understanding that all of the activity that you do online is creating a brand around yourself. That has an impact into the strength of your PLN. The messages that you put out to the world that is telling people who you are is going to basically be the message that gives them a decision of how strong they want to connect with you. So make sure that you're putting out a brand that is representative of what you want people to see and how you want people to connect with you. So we've been talking about this in the context of individuals. I want to talk a little bit about organizations as we get towards the end of our time here. Or how we do this as an organization is, it's not just individuals. How can organizations leverage this? Why is it better for organizations? First thing is that they help people solve internal problems. I mentioned earlier the example of me using Twitter during a meeting to solve a problem. It's not the only time I've ever done that. These networks help people solve these problems. And it's not just humans who are solving the problems, as the example I gave earlier. There have been many, many times that I have found the answer in my Digo library. I have found the answer because I have built the skill set on how to search the internet effectively. I have found the answer in a formal learning course, all around this idea of serving internal business problems. And again, if you want to foster this sort of we talk about all the different ways that we can build a learning culture. We tend to overcomplicate it. Some of the simplest things that we can do to help build a culture of learning in our organizations and get organizations to see the connection between learning, professional development, and the business is to make the opportunities to make the moments that we are able to leverage these things strategically to solve a business problem visible, to let people know this is how I solved the problem. I connected to this resource to the business and solved the problem, and now we're able to move on. Make it visible. That is huge in terms of anytime that you were able to solve the problem, let people know. Another reason that this is important to organizations is that innovation doesn't just happen. Innovation is, in a very overly simplified way, is when you connect seemingly unrelated ideas. The more you are able to connect different resources, be them human or otherwise, the more you are able to see the connection between the two seemingly unrelated ideas. That's where innovation happens. That's where you're able to discover something that's never existed within your organization before. And that only happens through the sharing activity that generally takes place in professional development and within your personal learning networks. So as we're getting a little short on time, just a couple of things I want to remind you about. First off, the biggest thing is that a personal learning network and your professional development as part of it is built strategically. It is not something that just happens. You have to make the choice, determine where, even something as simple as think about where you want to be 5 years from now, or 2 years from now, or 10 years from now, depending on what your plan is. Pick a future date that's out there. What do you want to be doing then? And then what is it going to take to get there? And do you have the resources in place? That is huge. I will also add, in terms of strategically, never underestimate the power of people within that network. I can honestly say that the trajectory of my career and where I'm at now as the executive director of the eLearning Guild would not be possible had I not been strategic about my network, had I not been strategic about the choices that I made in terms of the areas that I developed myself, and would not have been possible without the assistance of individuals and resources within my network tearing down barriers that might have been in the way of them. So you need to make some conscious choices in terms of how you're going to leverage your network. Also, make sure you're looking at unexpected resources within your PLN. Don't just think about the traditional. We have formal learning, and it is a big part of it, but it is, I am never going to be someone that makes formal learning seem like it's a bad thing. Formal learning is a great thing. I don't hate the course. I hate the course as the default, as an example. That's usually the phrase that I use when people push me on, well, don't you think courses are outdated? I don't think courses are outdated at all if they're used in the right context. You have to look outside of the traditional means of how we tend to think learning, what learning looks like. We're all conditioned through 12+ years of school as to what learning looks like, in air quotes. We have to look beyond that. We're learning increasingly through experiences. We're learning increasingly through the lens of people who look at things differently than we do ourselves. Look for unexpected resources that you can add to your PLN, because if you're looking at things differently, that's how you're going to see things differently. That's how you're going to be able to grow. And lastly, your PLN is going to open the door to all sorts of new and exciting possibilities. Goes back to the video I mentioned earlier from Eli Harris. If you want to see a world that's different, you have to be intentional about going beyond what you do every single day. You have to you have to be intentional about whatever is currently in your comfort zone, whatever is in your zone of daily practice. You have to make it a habit to look beyond that and find other communities and other resources that are outside of your inner circle, because that's where the growth comes in. That's where the exciting possibilities for you as an individual, for you as an organization, and ultimately for us as an industry land. You mentioned at the beginning that I'm part of the eLearning Guild. A lot of these resources are available through the Guild. If you're interested in learning more about that, I just encourage you to visit eLearningGuild.com. Membership in the Guild is completely free, whether it be our research report, our articles, our webinars. There's a huge amount of content that's available for free there, and a lot of them can help support your professional development network. I encourage you to check it out. Again, eLearningGuild.com for details there.
David,
yeah.
So are you still doing your curated email?
Yeah, so there are two angles of curation that I generally do. One, I think you touched on earlier, every single Monday on twist.elearningguild.net, it's at the eLearning Guild blog, I do a curated list, 6 articles every single week that I found most interesting from the previous week, add some context. There usually are some that are core within the L&D space, some that are outside the L&D space, but I always add 2 to 3 sentences of context. I do that every week. And then I also still, for conferences that I go to, try to curate the resources that are shared there, both to bookmark them for future reference, but also for people who weren't able to attend the conference, that they can learn from what was shared there.
And how do our attendees sign up for that weekly email?
If you go to twist.elearningguild.net and just sign up for the RSS feed, you can get it there. Or if you want to just send me an email at the email address you see on your screen, dkelly@elearningguild.com, I'll send you some details. I'll send you a quick link that you can use for that as well.
And I'm curious with the curation aspect. What is that? Well, how much time does that take you a week to put together?
You know, it's good question. So I go back a bit to what I had said earlier. When I was first doing it, it took a lot longer than I was doing it now. And it's not for the typical reason of I've developed a skill set or a workflow. It's that I found ways to integrate it into my workflow. So for instance, if I'm reading an article and I think it's really interesting, I'm not going to stop what I'm doing and then go to my blog, the blog post, and enter it and add the context in it. I simply click a bookmarklet in my browser for Digo, and it comes down, and and the tag that I put in is twist. So that when Monday morning comes and I want to write up that blog post, I just go into Digo, I look at the tag for twist curated content, and everything that I've bookmarked in the last week is there. And it just makes it a lot easier from a workflow standpoint that I know I want to do that every morning, but rather than starting, there was a point where that Monday morning email would come out and I would start from a place of, let me go find some things to share. Or I would go, you know, I was emailing myself links that I was like, oh, I don't want to forget about this, let me email myself. But then I just found this browser bookmarklet that just incorporated it into my workflow so that when I was actually consuming this thing that I thought was of value, I could very quickly click a button, tag it, add some context around why I thought this was useful, and then save it. And then when I come in Monday morning, it's just a matter of collecting those things that I had identified during the week and writing it up. So it makes it, again, finding ways to do this sort of thing in your existing workflow makes it a lot easier.
David, we have a question from the audience, a question from David Fox. He's asking, when working with clients within an organization, how can you simultaneously use social media to find solutions and respect internal company confidentiality?
So, good question. There is no answer that I can give you that is without context. So you have to be able to interpret this within the context of the organization. I do find transparency is key regardless of the context though. So in the example that I gave earlier where I was using social media in the midst of a meeting, I had earned a certain layer of trust within that group that I was in, that when I pulled out my phone, nobody thought that I was checking Facebook and to see no one thought I was wasting time. There was a certain layer of trust that I was doing something of value within the context of the meeting. So you have to kind of read the room and know your audience in that regard. The other thing I think is important is just a certain layer of transparency, that if you're going to do something like that and you're not sure if someone in the environment is going to look at it the way that you're intending, then call it out. Just tell someone and say, you know what, I might have a resource that can help us with this. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to send a quick message to this individual or check this particular portal so that they understand what you're doing with the device that's in your hands. I think both from a relationship building standpoint, that people don't think that you're bored at a meeting and going to do something else, but also from a full transparency standpoint of educating people on this is how we solve problems. You know, the more you're able to show that this is how I solve problems as an organization, you're modeling that behavior for the organization that you're working with, and that's over time that can start to build out in terms of other people doing that as well.
Okay, I don't think we have any more questions.
I want to thank you, David. Thank you so much for your time today and sharing. And I do want to also put one more plug in for what you're doing at the eLearning Guild. I think, you know, I know there's a business reason behind it, but I've found in the last 20 years that access to research papers that members have done, access to newsletters, access to your curation email every week has helped me stay in tune with what's going on. And I also enjoy every other year going to the conferences. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for being a part of this today.
Yep, thank you. And We will be sending up a follow-up email to all attendees with a link to the webinar. Thank you, everyone.